Pour the wine, Julian, for the Duke is already a ghost. The voice of Lady Beatrice drifted through the heavy oak doors of the master suite. Clara Miller stood perfectly still in the shadows of the antechamber. She held a porcelain basin of cold water. Her hands did not tremble. 50 feet away, in the center of a massive mahogany bed, Silas Thorne was burning alive. The Duke of Blackwood possessed a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The physician had packed his leather bag 20 minutes ago. He had shaken his head and offered no hope. The contagion was fierce and unknown. It had swept through the estate like a winter storm. Now the great house of Blackwood was packing up. They were not packing to save him. They were packing to abandon him. Clara listened to the clinking of crystal glasses from the adjoining sitting room. It was a farewell ceremony. They were celebrating his end while his chest still rose and fell with ragged breaths. "I don't want those silk drapes ruined," Lady Beatrice said. Her voice was sharp and devoid of warmth. "Take them down before the smell of death sets into the fabric." Julian, the Duke's younger half-brother, laughed softly. "He's not dead yet, Mother. We should at least pretend to mourn." Clara tightened her grip on the basin. The callousness was thick enough to choke on. She was only a maid. She wore a simple gray dress and a white apron. She did not matter in this world of wealth and power. Yet she possessed something these aristocrats lacked completely. She had dignity. She watched through the crack in the door as the remaining servants hurried past. They carried silver trays, velvet boxes, and oil paintings. They were looting the manor under the guise of relocating for their safety. The Duke had commanded this household with an iron fist. He was a man made of stone and silence. He terrified everyone who crossed his path. Clara had seen him break grown men with a single look. She had watched him rule his massive empire with absolute authority. But now he was just a man drowning in his own sweat. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. His face was bruised with exhaustion. He could not lift his hand. He could not issue a single order. The people who bowed to him yesterday were stealing his legacy today. The physician emerged from the sitting room and adjusted his heavy coat. "You must leave immediately, my lady," the doctor said. "The air is poisoned. He will not last the night." Beatrice did not shed a single tear. She patted her pearl necklace. "We are leaving for the London townhouse. Seal this wing. Do not let anyone in or out. If he passes, let the village undertaker deal with the remains. I won't risk my health for a corpse." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. They were leaving him to die alone. A man of his stature deserved better. Any human being deserved better. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, rushed into the antechamber. She looked at Clara with wide, terrified eyes. "Put that basin down, Clara," the older woman whispered frantically. "We are leaving. The carriages are waiting out front. Hurry up, or you will be left behind to catch the sickness." Clara looked down at the cold water. She looked back at the massive bed in the distance. The Duke shifted slightly. A low groan escaped his lips. It was a sound of pure agony. He was completely helpless. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood Hall, Clara saw him as vulnerable. She remembered the day she dropped a tray of tea in the main hallway. The other servants had braced for his wrath. The Duke had simply stepped over the broken porcelain and told the butler to ensure she was not cut. He did not yell. He did not punish her. He had simply walked away. It was a tiny moment. It meant nothing to him. But to a maid who had been beaten by her previous employers, it meant everything. "I am staying," Clara said quietly. Mrs. Gable gasped and grabbed Clara by the arm. "You're a fool. You'll die in this cursed house. He is beyond saving. Don't throw your life away for a man who does not even know your name." Clara gently pulled her arm free. She stood her ground. "Someone has to keep his fever down. I will not leave a living, breathing man to die in the dark." The housekeeper shook her head in disgust. "Suit yourself. But when the fever takes you, do not expect a proper burial." Mrs. Gable turned and ran down the grand staircase. She did not look back. Clara stood alone in the silence. The heavy front doors of the manor slammed shut. The sound echoed through the empty stone halls like thunder. Then came the sound of carriage wheels crunching against the gravel driveway. They were gone. The entire family, the loyal staff, the high society friends. Everyone had fled. The grand estate of Blackwood Hall was now a tomb. Clara took a deep breath. The air felt heavy and cold. She walked slowly into the master bedroom. The room was immense. It was decorated in deep greens and dark oak. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the moonlight. The only light came from a dying fire in the massive stone hearth. The shadows danced across the walls like ghosts. Clara set the porcelain basin on the nightstand. She looked down at Silas Thorne. He was a terrifyingly handsome man. Even in sickness, his jawline was sharp and unyielding. His broad chest heaved with the effort to pull air into his burning lungs. He was dying. She knew it. The doctor knew it. But Clara refused to accept it. She reached out and dipped a linen cloth into the cold water. She wrung it out carefully. Her fingers brushed against his forehead. His skin was radiating heat like a furnace. He flinched at the sudden cold. His eyes fluttered but remained closed. "It's just me, Your Grace," Clara whispered into the empty room. "I am here. You are not alone." She began to wipe the sweat from his face. She moved with quiet grace and steady hands. She did not know if he could hear her. She did not know if he could feel her touch. But she knew she could not stop. Hour after hour passed. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers. The temperature in the room dropped significantly. The winter wind howled against the glass windows. It sounded like an angry beast trying to break in. Clara pulled a thick wool blanket from a nearby chest and draped it over his shivering body. His fever was spiking again. He began to mutter incoherently. He spoke of battles and betrayals. He spoke of a coldness in his chest that would not go away. Clara leaned closer to listen. "They left me," the Duke whispered hoarsely. His voice was broken. It lacked the commanding power it usually held. "They always leave." Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest. She knew that feeling. She knew what it was like to be discarded by the people who were supposed to protect you. Her own family had sold her into service to pay their debts. They had handed her over to strangers and never looked back. She had spent years making herself invisible. She had learned to blend into the wallpaper and speak only when spoken to. But tonight, she was not invisible. She was the only thing standing between this powerful man and the grave. "I'm not leaving," Clara said. Her voice was surprisingly firm in the quiet room. "I don't care about your money or your title. I am staying right here." Silas let out a ragged breath. His hand twitched on the mattress. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, she reached out and took his large, calloused hand in hers. His fingers were burning hot. She held on tight. She wanted to anchor him to the living world. The clock in the hallway struck 3 in the morning. The darkest hour of the night. The hour when souls usually slipped away. Clara dipped the cloth into the water again. The water was growing warm from the heat of the room. She needed fresh water from the pump outside. She gently released his hand. She picked up the pitcher and turned toward the door. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her wrist. The grip was shockingly strong for a dying man. Felt like an iron vice. Clara gasped in surprise. She dropped the pitcher. It shattered on the stone floor. Water splashed everywhere. She spun around to face the bed. Silas Thorne was awake. His dark eyes were open. They were bloodshot and feverish, but they were entirely focused. He was staring directly at her. He did not look like a dying man. He looked like a beast that had just been awakened from a long slumber. He looked terrifying. Clara froze. She did not dare to move. She did not dare to breathe. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. The silence was absolute. He stared at her for a long time. His chest heaved. His grip on her wrist did not loosen. He pulled her slightly closer. His gaze pierced through her simple disguise. He saw past the gray dress and the white apron. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the quiet strength she had hidden from the world. He opened his mouth to speak. His throat was dry. His voice was nothing more than a harsh whisper. But the words he spoke sent a shiver down her spine. "They are gone," Silas said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Clara nodded slowly. She could not find her voice. Yes, your grace. They are gone. Silas did not let go of her wrist. His thumb brushed against her pulse point. He could feel her heart racing. He could feel her fear. But he also felt her warmth. Why are you here? He demanded softly. The question hung in the empty room. Clara looked at his bruised, exhausted face. She thought about the cruelty of his family. She thought about the empty carriages and the stolen silver. She squared her shoulders. She refused to cower. Because someone had to stay, Clara answered simply. A strange expression flickered across the Duke's face. It was a mix of disbelief and something much darker. Something dangerous. He finally released her wrist. His hand fell back onto the mattress. His eyes slowly slid shut. The immense effort had drained the last of his energy. But before he lost consciousness again, he whispered one final sentence. The words were so quiet Clara almost missed them. But they echoed in her mind long after the room fell silent again. Don't let me die, little bird, and I will give you the world. Clara stared at the sleeping Duke. The fire popped in the hearth. The shadows danced on the walls. The man who terrified the entire country was entirely in her care. She realized then that her quiet, invisible life was over. The Duke of Blackwood had just made a promise. And a man made of stone never broke his word. Clara turned around, picked up a towel to clean the broken pitcher, and prepared to fight death itself. The broken porcelain shards scattered across the stone floor looked like jagged ice in the dim light. Clara Miller did not waste a single second staring at them. She moved with quiet efficiency. She gathered the broken pieces and wiped the spilled water with a heavy linen towel. The master suite of Blackwood Hall was completely silent except for the harsh breathing of Silas Thorne. The Duke had fallen back into a deep unconsciousness after his startling promise. Clara knew the real battle was only just beginning. The temperature inside the manor was dropping rapidly. Outside, a brutal winter storm battered the heavy glass windows with freezing rain and wind. It was easily 10 degrees Fahrenheit beyond the stone walls. Without the army of servants to keep the dozens of hearths burning, the massive estate was turning into a frozen tomb. Clara walked over to the grand fireplace. The embers were glowing a dull orange. She gathered 3 large oak logs from the brass basket and placed them carefully onto the iron grate. She used a heavy iron poker to stoke the flames until they roared back to life. The fire cast long dancing shadows across the velvet curtains. It was the only source of warmth in a house built for cold aristocrats. Clara needed more water to keep his fever down. The pitcher was broken. She found a heavy silver bowl on a side table. She wrapped a thick woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders and picked up a brass lantern. She walked out of the bedroom and stepped into the long, echoing hallway. The darkness was absolute. The silence was deafening. Blackwood Hall was entirely empty. The grand portraits of former dukes stared down at her from the shadows. They looked proud and unforgiving. Clara did not care about their legacy. She only cared about the man fighting for his life in the room behind her. She descended the grand mahogany staircase. Each step groaned slightly under her weight. She walked through the abandoned kitchen. The copper pots hung perfectly still. The stoves were cold. She unbolted the heavy wooden back door and pushed it open. The freezing wind hit her like a physical blow, took her breath away. She trudged through 6 inches of fresh snow to reach the iron water pump in the courtyard. Her fingers were numb as she grasped the frozen handle. She pumped it with all her strength until the freezing water rushed into the silver bowl. She hurried back inside and locked the door behind her. She ran back up the stairs. Her lungs burned with the effort. When she returned to the master suite, Silas was thrashing on the bed. The fever was spiking again. He threw off the thick blankets. His chest heaved. He muttered angry commands to invisible soldiers. Clara set the bowl down and rushed to his side. She dipped a fresh cloth into the icy water and pressed it firmly against his forehead. He flinched away from the cold. "No," he muttered hoarsely. "Leave it." Clara did not listen. She held the cloth in place. "I'm not leaving anything, Your Grace," she said evenly. "You are burning up. You must endure this." She wiped the sweat from his neck and his broad chest. His skin was scorching hot. Hour after hour, she repeated the process. She fetched more water. She stoked the fire. She bathed his face. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She simply focused on keeping the invisible monster of death at bay. By the second night, Clara was exhausted. Her eyes burned. Her hands trembled from the constant cold water. She sat in a wooden chair beside his bed. The storm outside finally broke. The moonlight streamed through a gap in the heavy curtains. It illuminated his pale face. Silas was quiet now. The thrashing had stopped. His breathing was shallower but less strained. Clara leaned her head against the wooden post of the bed. She needed to stay awake. She needed to hear another human voice, even if it was her own. She began to speak to him. She did not know if he could hear her in the dark depths of his fever. She spoke anyway. "They say you have a heart of stone," Clara whispered into the quiet room. "The other servants are terrified of you. They say you destroyed Lord Harrington over a simple land dispute. They say you don't know how to forgive." She paused and looked at his motionless face. "But I don't believe them. I saw you feed a stray dog near the stables last month. You thought no one was watching. You gave it a piece of roasted meat from your own plate. A man with a stone heart doesn't care if a dog starves." Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "My father was not a cruel man either. He was just a weak man. He owed a debt of $300 to a very bad man in Boston. $300 is nothing to you. But to us it was the end of the world." Clara swallowed hard. The memory still felt like a physical wound. "He sold my contract of service to pay it. He put me on a carriage and told me to be a good girl. He didn't look me in the eye when the carriage pulled away. I was 17. She reached out and gently adjusted the blanket over his chest. "Your family left you because they are greedy. My family left me because they were cowards. I suppose we are both orphans in this massive house." Deep within the suffocating darkness of his fever, Silas Thorne heard a voice. It was not the shrieking voice of his stepmother. It was not the mocking laughter of his brother. It was a soft, steady voice. It felt like a tether tying him to the living world. He felt the cold shock of water on his burning skin. He felt the gentle touch of hands that did not recoil in disgust. He heard a story about a $300 debt and a carriage ride. The words echoed in his burning mind. He locked onto that voice. He used it as a shield against the suffocating heat. He fought his way upward through the layers of pain and darkness. He fought because the voice told him he was not a monster. He fought because someone was finally waiting for him to wake up. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever finally broke. Clara was dozing in the chair. Her head was resting on her arms crossed over the edge of the mattress. A sudden movement woke her. She bolted upright. Silas was sitting up slightly. He was leaning against the heavy oak headboard. His dark hair was a mess. His face was gaunt and shadowed with a thick beard. But his eyes were clear. The glassy haze of sickness was gone. They were sharp, piercing, and entirely focused on her. Clara gasped and jumped to her feet. "Your Grace," she breathed out. She quickly grabbed the silver bowl. "You're awake. You need water." She poured a small amount of fresh water into a crystal glass and brought it to his lips. Silas did not take the glass. He reached out and wrapped his large hand over her fingers. His skin was cool. The terrible heat was entirely gone. His touch sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. She froze. He guided her hand and the glass to his mouth. He drank the water slowly. He never took his eyes off her face. When the glass was empty, he released her hand. He leaned back against the pillows. He took a deep, steadying breath. "You are still here," Silas said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It was weak, but it carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "I told you I was staying," Clara replied quietly. She set the empty glass on the nightstand. She folded her hands in front of her apron to hide their slight trembling. Silas looked around the massive bedroom. The fire was burning brightly. The room was clean. The silver basin was full of fresh water. He looked back at Clara. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the pale exhaustion in her cheeks. He saw the absolute quiet dignity in her posture. How long? He asked. For days, your grace, Clara answered. The doctor left on the first night. He said you wouldn't survive until morning. Silas let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Dr. Evans is a fool. And my family? Clara hesitated. She did not want to cause him pain while he was still so weak. But she remembered the harsh reality of her own family. She decided to give him the truth. They packed the silver, the jewels, and the best paintings, Clara said evenly. Lady Beatrice ordered the wing sealed. They took the carriages to London. They left orders for the village undertaker to collect your remains. Silas did not flinch. His jaw tightened slightly. A dangerous, cold light flickered in his dark eyes. It was the look of a predator that had just realized it was out of its cage. I see, he murmured softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than any shout. They dug a grave for a duke. They will find out they buried a monster. He looked at Clara. The dangerous light softened just a fraction. And you are the maid who drops tea trays. Clara felt a blush creep up her neck. I only dropped it once, your grace. Silas tilted his head. You stood up to Mrs. Gable. You hauled water from the frozen pump. You kept the fires burning. You talked to me. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You heard me? I heard every word, Silas said. He shifted his weight on the bed. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored the weakness. He was a man who conquered his own body through sheer force of will. I heard about the dog. I heard about the coward in Boston. I heard you say we are both orphans. Clara looked down at the stone floor. She felt completely exposed. A maid was never supposed to speak so freely to a duke. She expected him to dismiss her. She expected him to remind her of her place. Instead, Silas reached out his hand. It hung in the empty air between them. Come here, he commanded softly. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, she stepped closer to the edge of the bed. Silas reached up and gently touched the bruised, exhausted skin under her eye. His touch was incredibly gentle for a man with such large, calloused hands. You saved my life, Clara Miller, Silas said. He knew her full name. That realization hit her like a lightning bolt. I don't owe debts, and I never forget a loyalty. He let his hand drop. His expression turned deadly serious. Listen to me very carefully. My family believes I'm dead. Let them believe it. Don't open the doors. Don't send for the doctor. We are going to lock this house down. Clara felt her heart pound against her ribs. She was suddenly part of a dangerous secret. But your grace, they will return eventually to claim the estate. Silas smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that promised absolute ruin. I'm counting on it. Let them plan their celebration. Let them read the false will. When they return to this house, I won't just take back my title. I will take everything they love. He looked at Clara with an intensity that made her breath catch. And as for you, you aren't a maid in this house anymore. You are the woman who holds the key to the Duke of Blackwood. Go downstairs. Lock the iron gates. And when you return, you will sit beside me, and we will plan how to destroy them. Clara looked at the man in the bed. He was no longer a dying patient. He was a king preparing for war. She did not feel fear. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe. She turned around and walked toward the door to lock out the world. The heavy iron ring of keys felt like ice against Clara Miller's palm. She walked through the grand foyer of Blackwood Hall. The marble floor was freezing under her thin shoes. She reached the massive front doors and pulled them open. The winter wind whipped her apron around her legs. Snow had drifted against the stone steps. She stepped out into the biting cold. It was at least 15 degrees Fahrenheit. She walked to the towering wrought iron gates that guarded the estate. Her fingers were stiff. She forced the largest iron key into the rusted lock. She turned it with all her strength. The heavy mechanism clicked into place with a loud metallic thud. She locked the pedestrian gate next. Then she locked the service entrance in the back. The estate was now a fortress. No one could get in. More importantly, no one could get out. She hurried back inside and bolted the heavy oak doors. She leaned against the wood for a moment. Her heart was beating fast. She was no longer just a maid. She was an accomplice to the most feared man in the country. She walked back up the grand staircase. The silence of the house was different now. It was not empty. It was waiting. When she returned to the master suite, Silas Thorne was no longer in the bed. Clara stopped in the doorway. Panic seized her throat. Then she saw him. He was sitting in a heavy leather armchair near the roaring fire. He wore a dark velvet robe over his white linen shirt. His face was still pale. His cheekbones were sharp. But the aura of death was completely gone. He looked like a king resting after a long war. "You should be in bed, Your Grace," Clara said. She walked into the room and set the keys on a side table. Silas looked at the iron ring. Then he looked at her. "I've spent enough time lying down," Silas said. His voice was stronger now. It was a deep baritone that filled the room. "Are the gates secure?" Clara nodded. "Yes, the main gate and the service entrances are locked. We are completely sealed off from the village." Silas nodded slowly. He stared into the flames. "Good. Let the rats think the ship has sunk." Clara walked over to the bed and began to strip the sweat-soaked linens. She moved efficiently. She did not want to think about the fact that she was trapped in a mansion with a man who could destroy lives with a single word. "Leave the bed," Silas commanded softly. Clara paused. She kept her hands on the heavy silk sheets. "The linens need to be washed, Your Grace. You cannot sleep in a fever bed." Silas turned his head to look at her. His dark eyes caught the firelight. "I said leave it. You aren't a maid anymore, Clara. We have established this." Clara slowly pulled her hands away from the bed. She stood awkwardly in the center of the huge room. She did not know what to do with her hands. She did not know how to exist around him without her duties to protect her. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Silas leaned back in the leather chair. He studied her. He saw the way she held her chin up. He saw the intelligence hidden behind her quiet demeanor. "You're going to help me understand exactly what my dear family did before they fled," he said. He pointed to a massive mahogany desk in the corner of the room. "Open the top drawer. Bring me the black leather ledger." Clara walked over to the desk. It was covered in dust. She opened the heavy drawer. She found a thick book bound in worn black leather. She picked it up and brought it to him. Silas did not take it. "Open it to the last entry," he instructed. Clara hesitated. "Your Grace, I cannot." She stopped herself. She had almost said she could not read. It was a lie she had told every employer since she was 17. A maid who could read was a dangerous thing. A maid who could read private ledgers was usually fired or worse. Silas raised an eyebrow. "You cannot what?" "Read." He let out a low breath. "Don't lie to me, little bird. I heard the words you used when you thought I was dying. You spoke of land disputes and debts with the vocabulary of an educated woman. Open the book." Clara felt her face grow hot. She opened the heavy cover. She flipped to the last page with writing on it. The ink was fresh. "Read it," he commanded. Clara looked down at the elegant cursive handwriting. It belonged to Julian, his half-brother. "It's a list of assets," Clara said quietly. Her voice was steady despite the fear in her chest. "He has listed the silver flatware from the dining room, 3 oil paintings from the West Wing, and the emerald necklace from your mother's safe." Silas clenched his jaw. A muscle feathered in his cheek. "He wrote this while I was bleeding from the lungs in the next room," he said softly. The quietness of his anger was terrifying. "What else?" Clara scanned the page. Her eyes widened slightly. "He has drafted a note to the estate lawyer in London. It says that due to your sudden passing, he requires immediate access to the operational funds of Blackwood." Silas let out a harsh laugh. It held no humor. It was the sound of a blade being drawn from a sheath. "He is careless," Silas said. "He thinks he has won. He thinks a crown is easy to wear." He looked at Clara. "Sit down." He pointed to a small wooden stool near his chair. Clara obeyed. She sat close to the fire. The heat warmed her frozen fingers. "My father was a general," Clara said suddenly. She did not know why she spoke. The words just slipped out. He taught me how to read maps before he taught me how to read books. He said knowledge was the only armor a person could never lose. Silas looked at her intently. You told me he sold you for a $300 debt. Clara looked down at her hands. He did. He was a brilliant soldier but a terrible gambler. When the army discharged him, he lost everything. He lost his mind. Then he lost me. Silas reached out. He did not touch her. His hand hovered near hers for a second. He was a fool, Silas said simply. He traded a diamond for a piece of copper. Clara looked up. Her breath hitched in her throat. The Duke of Blackwood was looking at her with an intensity that made the entire room fade away. He was not looking at a servant. He was looking at an equal. I'm going to need a general, Clara, Silas said. His voice was low and intimate. I cannot walk yet. I cannot hold a pen without my hand shaking. But my mind is perfectly clear. He leaned forward. The firelight cast dark shadows across his sharp features. They will return in a week. They will come dressed in black. They will pretend to weep for the village people. And they will try to claim this house. He locked his eyes onto hers. You're going to be my eyes and my hands until then. We are going to build a trap. Clara felt a strange thrill run through her blood. It was a terrifying feeling. It was also the most exhilarating thing she had ever felt. She was no longer invisible. She was necessary. What do you need me to do? She asked. Silas smiled. It was a predatory smile. First, we need to secure the armory. Then, we are going to rewrite my will. If Julian wants to play games with paper, I'll show him how a real monster writes a contract. Clara stood up. She placed the black ledger on the desk. She felt different. The gray dress and the white apron felt like a costume now. She was a woman preparing for battle. I'll get the keys to the armory, she said firmly. She turned to leave the room. Clara, Silas called out. She stopped and looked back. The powerful man in the chair was watching her with a possessiveness that made her skin tingle. Don't go to the kitchen tonight, he said. There is dried meat and cheese in the study. Bring it here. We will eat together. It was a command, but it felt like a request. Clara nodded. Yes, Your Grace. She walked out of the room. The hallway was still dark and freezing. But Clara Miller was not cold anymore. She had a purpose. She had a protector. And she was going to help him burn his enemies to the ground. The grand hallway felt endless as Clara Miller navigated the frozen shadows of Blackwood Hall. Her brass lantern cast a trembling circle of golden light against the towering oak panels. The air was so cold she could see her own breath pluming in the darkness. She walked past the draped furniture that looked like silent ghosts waiting in the corners. She reached the Duke's private study at the far end of the west wing. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and faint tobacco. She found the silver tray on a side table exactly where he had said it would be. It held dried beef, sharp yellow cheese, and half a loaf of crusty bread. Next to it was a heavy iron ring holding a single jagged key. It was the key to the armory and the floor safe. She picked up the tray and the key. The tray weighed at least 10 pounds, but she carried it with steady hands. She hurried back through the freezing corridors. She wanted to return to the only room in the massive estate that possessed any warmth. When she pushed open the heavy doors of the master suite, she stopped in surprise. Silas Thorne was standing up. He was leaning heavily against the marble mantel of the fireplace. His knuckles were white from the strain. His face was pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. He was pushing his recovering body to its absolute limits. Clara set the heavy tray down on the desk with a loud clatter. She rushed across the room. She did not ask for permission. She grabbed his arm and draped it over her shoulder to support his weight. You're going to kill yourself before your family even gets the chance, Clara scolded gently. Her voice was laced with genuine panic. Silas looked down at her. He was at least a foot taller than her. He could feel the surprising strength in her small frame. He let out a ragged breath and allowed her to help him back into the leather armchair. He sank into the cushions and closed his eyes for a moment. I needed to know if my legs would hold my weight, Silas said quietly. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. They're weak, but they work. I won't meet my brother sitting down. Clara walked over to the desk and brought the silver tray to the small table next to his chair. She poured 2 glasses of water from the crystal pitcher. She handed him one. He took it and drank it in one long swallow. Clara picked up a piece of the dried beef and a slice of bread. She held it out to him. He did not take it from her hand. He looked at the food and then looked up into her eyes. "Sit down and eat," Silas commanded. His tone left no room for argument. Clara pulled the wooden stool closer to the fire and sat down. She took a small bite of the bread. She had not realized how hungry she was until she tasted the food. They ate in complete silence for several minutes. It was an intimate silence. It was the kind of quiet shared by 2 soldiers resting in a trench before a battle. Clara watched the flames dance in the hearth. She felt the heavy gaze of the Duke resting upon her. She wiped her hands on her white apron. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the jagged iron key. She placed it on the table between them. "I found the key," Clara said. Silas picked up the heavy piece of metal. He turned it over in his large hands. The firelight glinted off the sharp edges. "My father had this key forged in London 30 years ago," Silas explained. "It opens the steel door in the cellar, and it opens the floor safe beneath this room." He leaned forward and pointed to a massive woven rug covering the stone floor near the bed. "Roll that back." Clara stood up and walked over to the thick Persian rug. It was incredibly heavy. She gripped the edge and pulled with all her strength. She managed to roll it back a few feet. Beneath the rug, the stone floor was perfectly smooth except for a small circular indentation. Silas handed her the iron key. "Put the key in the center of the stone and turn it twice to the right," he instructed. Clara knelt on the cold floor. She inserted the key into the hidden lock. The mechanism was stiff. She had to use both hands to twist it. Clicked loudly twice. A square section of the stone floor suddenly popped up. Clara pulled the heavy stone lid aside. Inside the dark hole was a steel box. It was the size of a small chest. "Bring it here," Silas said. Clara reached into the hole. The steel box was freezing cold and weighed over 20 pounds. She hauled it out of the floor and carried it over to his chair. She placed it carefully on his lap. Silas entered a combination on the brass dials located on the front of the box. The lock sprang open. He lifted the lid. Clara stood beside him and looked inside. The box did not contain gold or jewels. It contained stacks of thick parchment covered in red wax seals. It contained the true power of the Blackwood estate. Silas pulled out a thick document. The top page bore the official crest of the king. "This is the original deed to the estate," Silas said softly. His voice was laced with a dangerous edge. "Julian thinks the copy in the London bank is the real one. He doesn't know I had the terms legally altered 5 years ago." Silas placed the document on the table. He reached back into the steel box and pulled out a small wooden case. He opened it to reveal 2 beautifully crafted flintlock pistols. The silver barrels gleamed in the firelight. He picked one up and checked the firing mechanism. The loud click of the hammer echoed in the quiet room. "You're not going to shoot him, are you?" Clara asked. Her heart skipped a beat. Silas looked at her. The coldness in his eyes softened just a fraction. "No, little bird," he replied. "A bullet is too quick. I want to see his face when he realizes he is utterly ruined. But a man should always be prepared for desperate fools." He placed the pistol back into the velvet-lined case. He reached to the very bottom of the steel box and pulled out a small black velvet pouch. He held it in the palm of his hand. He looked at Clara for a long time. The silence in the room grew heavy. It was thick with unspoken words and rising tension. "I told you I would give you the world for saving my life," Silas whispered. He opened the velvet pouch. He pulled out a massive diamond ring. The stone was flawless and sparkled with a blinding inner fire. It was surrounded by a halo of deep blue sapphires. "This belonged to my mother," Silas said. "It is the true ring of the Duchess of Blackwood. Lady Beatrice has worn a fake replica for 15 years because my father refused to give her the real one." Clara took a step back. She shook her head. Panic fluttered in her chest. "Your Grace, I cannot accept that. It's a royal treasure. I'm just a maid." I only stayed because it was the right thing to do. I don't want a reward. Silas stood up. He ignored the trembling in his legs. He stepped closer to her. He towered over her, casting a massive shadow against the wall. He reached out and gently took her small, rough hand in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly tender. He looked down into her wide, fearful eyes. "You aren't just a maid," Silas said firmly. "You are the only person who saw me when I was completely broken. You fought for me in the dark. You are the only real thing in this entire house." He did not ask for permission. He slid the heavy diamond ring onto the third finger of her left hand. It was a perfect fit. The cold metal sent a shockwave up her arm. Clara stared at the ring. Felt incredibly heavy. It felt like a chain tying her to this terrifying, magnificent man. She tried to pull her hand away, but he held on tight. "They are going to return expecting to read my will," Silas continued. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper that made her shiver. "They expect to inherit everything. But when those doors open, they aren't going to find a dead man. They are going to find a living duke. And they are going to find his duchess." Clara looked up at his face. She saw the absolute determination in his dark eyes. He was not joking. He was not playing a game. He was rewriting her entire destiny with a single piece of jewelry. The forgotten daughter who had been sold for $300 was suddenly wearing a fortune on her finger. Silas reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch made her breath catch in her throat. "We have 3 days to prepare the trap," Silas said. "Are you ready to watch them fall?" Clara looked down at the ring. She thought about the father who had abandoned her. She thought about Lady Beatrice who had treated her like dirt. She thought about the terrible coldness of the world outside these walls. She looked back up at the powerful man who had chosen her out of the shadows. She stopped being afraid. She squared her shoulders and met his gaze with a fierce fire in her own eyes. "Tell me what to do," Clara said. The heavy diamond ring felt like a circle of fire on Clara Miller's left hand. She sat at the massive mahogany desk in the corner of the master suite. Silas Thorne sat across from her in the leather armchair. He had instructed her to bring a stack of fresh parchment and a silver inkwell. The estate was completely silent. The winter storm outside had finally exhausted itself. The snow was piled 3 feet high against the stone walls of Blackwood Hall. The temperature remained well below freezing. But inside this room, the air was thick with heat and anticipation. Clara dipped a sharp quill into the black ink. She waited for his command. Silas leaned his head back against the leather chair. His dark eyes were fixed on the painted ceiling. He was calculating his vengeance. "Write the date first," Silas instructed softly. "Make sure the handwriting is clear. The estate lawyers in London are meticulous men. They will look for any excuse to invalidate a document written by a woman." Clara pressed the quill to the heavy paper. She wrote the date in elegant flowing script. Her father had made sure her penmanship was flawless before his gambling debts ruined their lives. She did not know that this skill would one day help topple a dynasty. "I am ready," Clara said. Silas lowered his gaze. He looked at her illuminated by the candlelight. He saw the way the diamond flashed on her finger every time she moved her hand. It was a brand of his protection. "Begin with the standard legal phrasing," Silas said. "I, Silas Thorne, Duke of Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments." Clara wrote quickly. The scratching of the quill was the only sound in the room. She did not hesitate. "Next paragraph," Silas continued. His voice was a low rumble. "I leave the entirety of my unentailed wealth, including the London townhouse, the northern coal mines, and the sum of $500,000 in the Bank of England, to my lawful wife, the Duchess of Blackwood." Clara stopped writing. Her hand hovered over the parchment. A drop of black ink fell from the quill and stained the edge of the paper. She looked up at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, "you cannot put that in writing. I am wearing your mother's ring to help you play a trick on your family. We are not legally married. The lawyers will know this is a fraud." Silas did not smile. He pushed himself up from the armchair. His legs were steadier now. The fever had burned away his physical strength, but his iron will was returning. He walked slowly across the 10 feet of space that separated them. He stood right behind her chair. Clara could feel the heat radiating from his large body. She could smell the scent of cedar and faint masculine sweat. "I don't play tricks, Clara," Silas said quietly. He leaned down. His face was only inches from hers. "A trick is what my brother played when he stole my mother's emeralds. A trick is what my stepmother played when she planned my funeral while I was still breathing. I am building a fortress, and a fortress requires a queen." He reached over her shoulder and placed his large hand over hers. He guided her fingers to hold the quill firmly. "We are going to sign a marriage contract right after we finish this will. By the time my family returns to this house, you'll be my legal wife before God and the law. Now, keep writing." Clara swallowed hard. She felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She was entirely trapped in his orbit. She was a maid who had drawn water from a frozen pump yesterday. Today, she was writing a document that would make her the richest woman in the country. She forced her hand to move. She wrote down his exact words. Silas dictated for another hour. He systematically stripped Julian and Lady Beatrice of every single penny they thought they owned. He left them only a small crumbling cottage on the edge of a swamp that belonged to the estate. It was an insult disguised as an inheritance. He pulled the heavy velvet drape back just an inch. Clara hurried to his side. She peered through the narrow gap. The courtyard was buried in fresh white snow. At the massive iron gates, a solitary figure was violently shaking the iron bars. It was a man wearing a thick black coat. A simple wooden cart was parked behind him. A single tired horse stomped its hooves in the freezing slush. "It's the village undertaker," Silas said softly. A dark, amused sound escaped his throat. "Lady Beatrice must have paid him a handsome sum to fetch my corpse before the snow trapped it inside." Clara watched the man outside. He was kicking the frozen lock on the gate. He was frustrated. He did not know that a monster was watching him from the shadows. "What do we do?" Clara asked. She looked up at Silas. The side of his face was bathed in the cold gray light of dawn. He looked incredibly dangerous. "We do absolutely nothing," Silas answered. He let the velvet drape fall closed. The room plunged back into the warm glow of the firelight. Let him freeze for a few minutes. Let him realize the gates are chained from the inside. He'll go back to the village and tell everyone that Blackwood Hall is locked tight. The rumor will spread. My family will hear it. They'll think my loyal servants locked the house to protect my body. It will only make them more arrogant when they finally arrive to break the doors down. Clara turned to face him. They were standing very close together. The adrenaline of the moment made her blood race. She was no longer afraid of the dark house. She was no longer afraid of the empty halls. She was only aware of the massive man standing in front of her. Silas looked down at her. He saw the courage in her eyes. He reached out and gently traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. His touch was electric. "You have not slept in 5 days," Silas murmured. The harshness in his voice was entirely gone. "You're running on nothing but sheer will and dried bread. You need to rest." Clara shook her head. "I cannot sleep. Not while he is out there. Not while they are coming." Silas stepped closer. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her gently against his chest. Clara gasped softly. She felt the solid wall of his muscles. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. It was the heart she had kept beating. "I'm not asking you," Silas said. His chin rested on the top of her head. "I'm commanding you, as your duke, and as your future husband." He picked her up effortlessly. Clara let out a small cry of surprise. Her arms instinctively wrapped around his broad shoulders. He carried her across the room to the massive oak bed. He laid her down gently on the fresh silk sheets she had prepared earlier. Clara tried to sit up. "Your Grace, I cannot sleep in your bed. It's entirely improper." Silas leaned over her. He placed a hand on either side of her shoulders. He trapped her in the warmth of the bed. "Nothing about us is proper, Clara. You're a maid wearing a royal diamond. I'm a dead man walking. The rules don't apply to us anymore. He pulled the heavy quilt up to her chin. He did not get into the bed with her. He walked back to the leather armchair and sat down. He picked up the flintlock pistol from the table. He rested it on his knee. He looked at her through the dim light. "Close your eyes," Silas commanded softly. "I'll watch the door. No one is going to touch you. Not today. Not ever again." Clara looked at the feared Duke of Blackwood guarding her while she slept. The exhaustion finally crashed over her like a heavy wave. She closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she was completely safe. 3 days passed in absolute isolation. The grand estate of Blackwood Hall remained completely silent under a thick blanket of white snow. Clara Miller did not wear her gray Maid uniform anymore. Silas had ordered her to wear a dark blue velvet dress he found in a forgotten guest room trunk. The heavy fabric kept out the bitter cold that seeped through the stone walls. Around her neck, hidden safely beneath the high collar of the dress, hung a silver chain. Attached to the chain was the massive diamond ring. Silas had told her to keep it hidden until the perfect moment. That moment was rapidly approaching. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a freezing Tuesday. Clara stood near the tall windows of the grand library. The temperature outside was barely 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The pale winter sun offered no warmth. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the sound of heavy wooden wheels crushing the frozen gravel. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She looked through the glass. 3 magnificent black carriages pulled through the iron gates. The undertaker must have told them the gates were locked, so they had brought estate workers to break the chains. But Silas had instructed Clara to unlock the main gates an hour ago. The trap was officially open. Clara turned around. Silas Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair near the unlit fireplace. He was no longer the dying man she had bathed with cold water. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was brushed back. His face was cleanly shaved. The bruising under his eyes had faded into sharp, aristocratic angles. He looked like a terrifying king. "They're here," Clara said quietly. Her voice did not tremble. She was ready. Silas slowly stood up. He did not need to lean on the chair. His strength had returned with a vengeance. He walked over to the window and looked down at the courtyard. Lady Beatrice stepped out of the first carriage. She was draped in expensive black silk mourning clothes. A heavy black veil covered her face. Julian followed her. He wore a sharp black coat and a silver pocket watch. They looked like vultures arriving for a feast. Silas let out a low, dangerous breath. "Look at them," he murmured. "They didn't even bring a coffin. They only brought a lawyer." He pointed to a small, nervous man stepping out of the third carriage carrying a thick leather briefcase. "Go downstairs, Clara. Open the front doors. Let them into the main drawing room. Do exactly as I told you." Clara nodded. She walked out of the library and descended the grand mahogany staircase. The heavy knocker on the front door pounded loudly through the empty foyer. Clara reached the heavy oak doors and pulled them open. The freezing wind swept into the house. Lady Beatrice stood on the top step. She did not look sad. She looked utterly annoyed by the cold. She pushed past Clara without a single word. Julian walked in next. He paused and looked at Clara. He noticed the blue velvet dress. "You're still alive," Julian said with a cruel smirk. "I assumed the fever would have taken the rest of the useless staff by now. Where's Mrs. Gable?" Clara kept her eyes lowered to play her part. "She fled with the others, sir," Clara answered softly. "I'm the only one who stayed." Julian laughed. "How pathetic. Well, fetch us some hot tea immediately." The journey was freezing. "And tell the estate manager to prepare a room for Mr. Sterling." He gestured to the nervous lawyer. Clara bowed her head slightly. "Yes, sir." She walked toward the kitchen. She could hear their loud footsteps echoing into the grand drawing room. They did not ask about the Duke. They did not ask where his body was resting. They only cared about the warmth of the fire and the contents of the lawyer's briefcase. Clara prepared a silver tray with hot tea and porcelain cups. She carried it into the drawing room 10 minutes later. Lady Beatrice had removed her black veil. She was warming her hands by the roaring fire Clara had built earlier that morning. Julian was pouring himself a glass of expensive brandy from a crystal decanter. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was sitting at a large round table. He was laying out several pieces of thick parchment. Clara set the tea tray down on a side table. She moved silently. She poured the tea and handed a cup to the older woman. "I can't believe the smell in this house," Beatrice complained loudly. "It smells like sickness and cheap wood smoke. We've got to have the entire West Wing thoroughly scrubbed with bleach before we host the morning ball." Julian took a sip of his brandy. "We'll hire a completely new staff, Mother. I don't want anyone from his era remaining in my house." He emphasized the word, my. Clara stood near the wall. She kept her hands folded in front of her. Above the drawing room, hidden behind a wooden grate in the upper gallery, Silas Thorne was watching everything. He could hear every single word. The architecture of Blackwood Hall was designed to allow the Duke to listen to his guests from the shadows. Julian walked over to the table and tapped the parchment with his finger. "Let's get this over with, Sterling," Julian commanded. "I want the transition of power completed before the sun goes down." Mr. Sterling adjusted his spectacles. He looked nervous. "Sir, protocol dictates that we've got to first confirm the passing of the Duke. We need a death certificate or at least a visual confirmation of the remains." Lady Beatrice slammed her teacup down. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "The man had a fever of 104 degrees. He was coughing blood. He's been locked in a freezing house for a week. He's dead. We aren't going upstairs to look at a rotting corpse." Julian nodded in agreement. "My mother's right. I'm the new Duke of Blackwood. You'll read the will I provided you." Mr. Sterling wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold room. "Very well, Your Grace," the lawyer stammered. He picked up the top document. "This is the final testament of Silas Thorne, dated 3 weeks prior to his unfortunate illness." Clara listened carefully. She knew Silas had not written a will 3 weeks ago. This was the forgery. Julian had planned this theft long before the fever ever struck. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "I, Silas Thorne, do hereby leave the entirety of my estate, my titles, and all financial assets to my beloved half-brother, Julian Thorne. Lady Beatrice Thorne shall receive a lifetime stipend of $100,000 annually, and full residence at the London townhouse." Julian smiled. It was a greedy, ugly smile. He took another long sip of his brandy. "It's perfectly clear," Julian said. He finally realized the importance of family in his final days. Clara felt a wave of absolute disgust. They were standing in his house, drinking his liquor, and stealing his life with a piece of fake paper. She looked up slightly toward the wooden grate near the high ceiling. She could not see Silas, but she knew he was there. She knew he was smiling his terrifying, cold smile. The lawyer pulled out a secondary document. "There's also the matter of the immediate cash reserves," Mr. Sterling added. "The document authorizes Julian to withdraw the $500,000 currently held in the Bank of England for emergency estate repairs." Lady Beatrice laughed softly. "Emergency repairs. Yes, we'll definitely need to buy new silk drapes for the ballroom. The old ones are dreadfully out of fashion." Clara stood perfectly still. The audacity of these people was suffocating. They were not just stealing his wealth. They were erasing his entire existence. Julian turned to Clara. He looked at her with utter contempt. "You," Julian barked. "What's your name?" "Clara, sir," she replied evenly. "Well, Clara, you're fired," Julian said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Pack whatever miserable rags you own and leave my property immediately. If you're still here in an hour, I'll have the estate guards throw you into the snow." Clara did not flinch. She did not cry. She remembered the heavy diamond resting against her skin. She remembered the promise the real Duke had made to her in the dark. She looked directly into Julian's eyes. It was a blatant act of defiance for a servant. Julian frowned. He was not used to servants looking him in the eye. "Did you hear me?" Julian snapped. "I said get out." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but she did not get the chance. The heavy oak doors of the drawing room suddenly slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound echoed like a cannon shot in the large room. Mr. Sterling jumped out of his chair. Julian spilled his brandy on the expensive rug. Lady Beatrice gasped and clutched her pearl necklace. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. The heavy footsteps of a massive man echoed from the grand hallway. They were slow. They were deliberate. They sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Every person in the drawing room froze. The footsteps stopped right outside the closed doors. The brass handles slowly turned. The doors swung open. Silas Thorne stood in the doorway. He was a towering shadow against the pale light of the hallway. He looked completely immaculate and incredibly lethal. His dark eyes locked onto his brother. Julian dropped his crystal glass. It shattered into 100 pieces on the floor. His face turned the color of ash. He could not breathe. Lady Beatrice let out a strangled shriek. She backed away until she hit the stone mantel of the fireplace. Mr. Sterling dropped the forged will. The papers scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Silas stepped into the room. The silence was so profound Clara could hear the frantic beating of Julian's heart. Silas did not yell. He did not rush forward. He simply looked at the people who had tried to bury him. "I see you've started the celebration without me," Silas said. His deep voice resonated through the room. It was smooth, cold, and dripping with absolute menace. "Who told you I was dead?" No one answered. They were completely paralyzed by terror. Silas slowly walked toward the table. He stepped on the forged documents with his polished leather boots. He stopped in front of his trembling brother. Julian was shaking violently. Silas," Julian stammered. His voice was a pathetic squeak. "You're alive. It's a miracle. We thought the fever." Silas tilted his head slightly. The predatory look in his eyes was terrifying to behold. "You thought you could steal my crown while my bed was still warm." Silas finished the sentence for him. "You thought a piece of fake paper could make you a king." He turned his gaze to Lady Beatrice. She was pressing her hand over her mouth, visibly hyperventilating. "And you, stepmother, I hope you didn't order those new silk drapes yet." Silas walked over to Clara. He stopped right beside her. He reached out and gently placed his large hand on the small of her back. It was a public gesture of absolute protection. It shocked the family even more than his resurrection. Julian stared at the Duke's hand resting on the servant's dress. He could not process what he was seeing. "Silas, what are you doing?" Julian asked weakly. "She's just a maid. I just fired her." Silas smiled. It was the smile of a beast right before it snaps the neck of its prey. "You can't fire her, Julian," Silas said softly. The entire room held its breath. The Duke of Blackwood looked down at Clara. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second before turning back to ice as he faced his brother. "Because she isn't a maid. She's the woman who's going to take absolutely everything from you." 3 days passed in absolute isolation. The grand estate of Blackwood Hall remained completely silent under a thick blanket of white snow. Clara Miller did not wear her gray maid uniform anymore. Silas had ordered her to wear a dark blue velvet dress he found in a forgotten guest room trunk. The heavy fabric kept out the bitter cold that seeped through the stone walls. Around her neck, hidden safely beneath the high collar of the dress, hung a silver chain. Attached to the chain was the massive diamond ring. Silas had told her to keep it hidden until the perfect moment. That moment was rapidly approaching. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a freezing Tuesday. Clara stood near the tall windows of the grand library. The temperature outside was barely 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The pale winter sun offered no warmth. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the sound of heavy wooden wheels crushing the frozen gravel. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She looked through the glass. 3 magnificent black carriages pulled through the iron gates. The undertaker must have told them the gates were locked, so they had brought estate workers to break the chains. But Silas had instructed Clara to unlock the main gates an hour ago. The trap was officially open. Clara turned around. Silas Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair near the unlit fireplace. He was no longer the dying man she had bathed with cold water. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was brushed back. His face was cleanly shaved. The bruising under his eyes had faded into sharp, aristocratic angles. He looked like a terrifying king. "They're here," Clara said quietly. Her voice did not tremble. She was ready. Silas slowly stood up. He did not need to lean on the chair. His strength had returned with a vengeance. He walked over to the window and looked down at the courtyard. Lady Beatrice stepped out of the first carriage. She was draped in expensive black silk mourning clothes. A heavy black veil covered her face. Julian followed her. He wore a sharp black coat and a silver pocket watch. They looked like vultures arriving for a feast. Silas let out a low, dangerous breath. "Look at them," he murmured. "They didn't even bring a coffin. They only brought a lawyer." He pointed to a small, nervous man stepping out of the third carriage carrying a thick leather briefcase. "Go downstairs, Clara. Open the front doors. Let them into the main drawing room. Do exactly as I told you." Clara nodded. She walked out of the library and descended the grand mahogany staircase. The heavy knocker on the front door pounded loudly through the empty foyer. Clara reached the heavy oak doors and pulled them open. The freezing wind swept into the house. Lady Beatrice stood on the top step. She did not look sad. She looked utterly annoyed by the cold. She pushed past Clara without a single word. Julian walked in next. He paused and looked at Clara. He noticed the blue velvet dress. "You're still alive," Julian said with a cruel smirk. "I assumed the fever would have taken the rest of the useless staff by now. Where's Mrs. Gable?" Clara kept her eyes lowered to play her part. "She fled with the others, sir," Clara answered softly. "I'm the only one who stayed." Julian laughed. "How pathetic. Well, fetch us some hot tea immediately." The journey was freezing. "And tell the estate manager to prepare a room for Mr. Sterling." He gestured to the nervous lawyer. Clara bowed her head slightly. "Yes, sir." She walked toward the kitchen. She could hear their loud footsteps echoing into the grand drawing room. They did not ask about the Duke. They did not ask where his body was resting. They only cared about the warmth of the fire and the contents of the lawyer's briefcase. Clara prepared a silver tray with hot tea and porcelain cups. She carried it into the drawing room 10 minutes later. Lady Beatrice had removed her black veil. She was warming her hands by the roaring fire Clara had built earlier that morning. Julian was pouring himself a glass of expensive brandy from a crystal decanter. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was sitting at a large round table. He was laying out several pieces of thick parchment. Clara set the tea tray down on a side table. She moved silently. She poured the tea and handed a cup to the older woman. "I can't believe the smell in this house," Beatrice complained loudly. "It smells like sickness and cheap wood smoke. We've got to have the entire West Wing thoroughly scrubbed with bleach before we host the morning ball." Julian took a sip of his brandy. "We'll hire a completely new staff, Mother. I don't want anyone from his era remaining in my house." He emphasized the word, my. Clara stood near the wall. She kept her hands folded in front of her. Above the drawing room, hidden behind a wooden grate in the upper gallery, Silas Thorne was watching everything. He could hear every single word. The architecture of Blackwood Hall was designed to allow the Duke to listen to his guests from the shadows. Julian walked over to the table and tapped the parchment with his finger. "Let's get this over with, Sterling," Julian commanded. "I want the transition of power completed before the sun goes down." Mr. Sterling adjusted his spectacles. He looked nervous. "Sir, protocol dictates that we've got to first confirm the passing of the Duke. We need a death certificate or at least a visual confirmation of the remains." Lady Beatrice slammed her teacup down. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "The man had a fever of 104 degrees. He was coughing blood. He's been locked in a freezing house for a week. He's dead. We aren't going upstairs to look at a rotting corpse." Julian nodded in agreement. "My mother's right. I'm the new Duke of Blackwood. You'll read the will I provided you." Mr. Sterling wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold room. "Very well, Your Grace," the lawyer stammered. He picked up the top document. "This is the final testament of Silas Thorne, dated 3 weeks prior to his unfortunate illness." Clara listened carefully. She knew Silas had not written a will 3 weeks ago. This was the forgery. Julian had planned this theft long before the fever ever struck. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. I, Silas Thorne, do hereby leave the entirety of my estate, my titles, and all financial assets to my beloved half-brother, Julian Thorne. Lady Beatrice Thorne shall receive a lifetime stipend of $100,000 annually, and full residence at the London townhouse. Julian smiled. It was a greedy, ugly smile. He took another long sip of his brandy. It's perfectly clear, Julian said. He finally realized the importance of family in his final days. Clara felt a wave of absolute disgust. They were standing in his house, drinking his liquor, and stealing his life with a piece of fake paper. She looked up slightly toward the wooden grate near the high ceiling. She could not see Silas, but she knew he was there. She knew he was smiling his terrifying, cold smile. The lawyer pulled out a secondary document. There's also the matter of the immediate cash reserves, Mr. Sterling added. The document authorizes Julian to withdraw the $500,000 currently held in the Bank of England for emergency estate repairs. Lady Beatrice laughed softly. Emergency repairs. Yes, we'll definitely need to buy new silk drapes for the ballroom. The old ones are dreadfully out of fashion. Clara stood perfectly still. The audacity of these people was suffocating. They were not just stealing his wealth. They were erasing his entire existence. Julian turned to Clara. He looked at her with utter contempt. You, Julian barked. What's your name? Clara, sir, she replied evenly. Well, Clara, you're fired, Julian said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Pack whatever miserable rags you own and leave my property immediately. If you're still here in an hour, I'll have the estate guards throw you into the snow. Clara did not flinch. She did not cry. She remembered the heavy diamond resting against her skin. She remembered the promise the real Duke had made to her in the dark. She looked directly into Julian's eyes. It was a blatant act of defiance for a servant. Julian frowned. He was not used to servants looking him in the eye. Did you hear me? Julian snapped. I said get out. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but she did not get the chance. The heavy oak doors of the drawing room suddenly slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound echoed like a cannon shot in the large room. Mr. Sterling jumped out of his chair. Julian spilled his brandy on the expensive rug. Lady Beatrice gasped and clutched her pearl necklace. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. The heavy footsteps of a massive man echoed from the grand hallway. They were slow. They were deliberate. They sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Every person in the drawing room froze. The footsteps stopped right outside the closed doors. The brass handles slowly turned. The doors swung open. Silas Thorne stood in the doorway. He was a towering shadow against the pale light of the hallway. He looked completely immaculate and incredibly lethal. His dark eyes locked onto his brother. Julian dropped his crystal glass. It shattered into 100 pieces on the floor. His face turned the color of ash. He could not breathe. Lady Beatrice let out a strangled shriek. She backed away until she hit the stone mantel of the fireplace. Mr. Sterling dropped the forged will. The papers scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Silas stepped into the room. The silence was so profound Clara could hear the frantic beating of Julian's heart. Silas did not yell. He did not rush forward. He simply looked at the people who had tried to bury him. I see you've started the celebration without me, Silas said. His deep voice resonated through the room. It was smooth, cold, and dripping with absolute menace. Who told you I was dead? No one answered. They were completely paralyzed by terror. Silas slowly walked toward the table. He stepped on the forged documents with his polished leather boots. He stopped in front of his trembling brother. Julian was shaking violently. Silas, Julian stammered. His voice was a pathetic squeak. You're alive. It's a miracle. We thought the fever. Silas tilted his head slightly. The predatory look in his eyes was terrifying to behold. You thought you could steal my crown while my bed was still warm. Silas finished the sentence for him. You thought a piece of fake paper could make you a king. He turned his gaze to Lady Beatrice. She was pressing her hand over her mouth, visibly hyperventilating. And you, stepmother. I hope you didn't order those new silk drapes yet. Silas walked over to Clara. He stopped right beside her. He reached out and gently placed his large hand on the small of her back. It was a public gesture of absolute protection. It shocked the family even more than his resurrection. Julian stared at the Duke's hand resting on the servant's dress. He could not process what he was seeing. "Silas, what are you doing?" Julian asked weakly. "She's just a maid. I just fired her." Silas smiled. It was the smile of a beast right before it snaps the neck of its prey. "You can't fire her, Julian," Silas said softly. The entire room held its breath. The Duke of Blackwood looked down at Clara. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second before turning back to ice as he faced his brother. "Because she isn't a maid. She's the woman who's going to take absolutely everything from you." The silence in the drawing room of Blackwood Hall was heavy enough to crush bone. Julian Thorne stared at the massive hand of his brother resting gently on the back of a maid. He shook his head in frantic denial. "You've lost your mind to the fever," Julian stammered. "You're delirious. She's a nobody." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet menace radiating from him filled every corner of the massive room. "She is the only reason I'm breathing," Silas corrected smoothly. He stepped forward and deliberately placed himself between Clara and his family. He became an impenetrable wall of broad shoulders and dark tailored fabric. He looked down at the forged documents scattered across the expensive Persian rug. He slowly picked up the paper with the false signature. He held it up to the light of the roaring fire. "This is very poor work, Julian. The ink is too fresh. The loop on the capital letter is entirely wrong. I suppose desperation makes a man sloppy." Julian took a step backward. His silver pocket watch clinked against his trembling chest. "I didn't forge anything," Julian lied. "You signed it weeks ago. You just don't remember because of the illness." Silas let out a dark sound that was a mix of a sigh and a laugh. He walked toward the massive stone fireplace. He tossed the parchment directly into the flames. The paper curled and blackened instantly. The forged legacy turned to ash in less than 3 seconds. Mr. Sterling let out a pathetic squeak of terror. He dropped to his knees and frantically began to gather the remaining papers. "Your Grace, I swear on my life, I didn't know," the lawyer pleaded. "Lord Julian told me you were dead. He told me the document was genuine. Please don't ruin me." Silas looked down at the trembling man. "Get out of my house, Sterling. If I ever see your face inside the county lines again, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life breaking rocks in a prison quarry." The lawyer scrambled to his feet. He did not even bother to close his leather briefcase. He ran for the heavy oak doors and disappeared into the hallway. The sound of his frantic footsteps echoed away into silence. Silas turned his dark eyes back to his family. Lady Beatrice was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Her face was chalky white. She looked exactly like a ghost. "You sent a wooden cart for me, stepmother?" Silas stated coldly. "You hired the village undertaker to collect my body like a piece of spoiled meat. You didn't even have the decency to purchase a proper coffin." Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was entirely trapped by her own cruelty. Silas stepped closer to her. He towered over the older woman. "I heard you complain about the smell of my sickness. I heard you plan your morning ball while I was choking on my own blood. You wanted to scrub this wing with bleach to erase me. The only thing rotting in this house is your heart." Julian suddenly lunged forward. He was driven by pure panic and greedy desperation. "You can't do this," Julian yelled. "I'm your brother. I have rights. Half of this estate belongs to my mother. You can't just burn a legal document and pretend nothing happened." Silas turned to face his brother. The absolute stillness of his posture was terrifying. "You have no rights, Julian. You're a thief. You stole the silver flatware. You stole the oil paintings. You broke open my mother's safe and stole her emeralds while I was unconscious." Silas took a step toward his brother. Julian scrambled backward until his back hit the cold stone wall. "I'm not going to call the magistrate," Silas said softly. "I'm not going to have you arrested for theft and forgery. Because I want something much worse for you. Silas reached into the pocket of his dark suit coat. He pulled out the heavy gold signet ring and a thick roll of parchment sealed with red wax. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud right where the forged will had been. "This is my true testament," Silas declared. "It is legally binding. It leaves every single penny, every piece of land, and the London townhouse to my lawful wife." Julian stared at the roll of parchment. His eyes darted to Clara. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Your wife? You aren't married. You're trying to bluff me. You're going to leave the greatest fortune in the country to a servant girl who empties chamber pots? The king won't allow it." Silas turned his head slowly. He looked at Clara. He held out his hand. Clara knew exactly what he wanted. She took a deep breath to steady her racing heart. She walked out from the shadows near the wall. She stepped into the warm light of the fire. She placed her small hand into his large one. Silas lifted her hand for the entire room to see. The massive diamond ring flashed with blinding brilliance. The blue sapphires caught the firelight. Lady Beatrice gasped loudly. Her knees buckled and she slumped against the arm of a velvet sofa. "That's the Duchess' ring," Beatrice whispered in absolute horror. "Your father promised that ring to me. It's mine." Silas did not even look at his stepmother. He kept his eyes locked on his brother. "It belongs to the woman who stayed," Silas said. His voice was a vow of absolute destruction. "Clara Miller is the Duchess of Blackwood. And as of this morning, you are entirely penniless." Julian stared at the diamond. The reality of his ruin finally crashed over him. His arrogant posture crumbled. He looked like a frightened child. "Please," Julian begged. "Silas, I'm sorry. I was afraid. We thought you were gone. Don't cast us out. The winter storm is brutal. It's 20 degrees outside. Where will we go?" Silas let go of Clara's hand. He walked over to the side table and poured himself a glass of water from the silver pitcher. He drank it slowly. He let them suffer in the agonizing silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no mercy. "You'll go to the swamp cottage on the eastern edge of the property. It has a leaking roof and a dirt floor. You'll live there until I decide what to do with you. And you will not take the carriages." Lady Beatrice let out a hysterical sob. "You expect me to walk? It's a journey of 3 miles. In the freezing snow. I'll die of the cold." Silas set the crystal glass down on the tray. It made a sharp clinking sound. "Clara walked through the freezing snow to draw water from an iron pump to keep me alive," Silas replied evenly. "If a maid can survive the winter, I'm sure an aristocrat can manage." He looked at the heavy oak doors. "Leave your heavy coats. Leave your jewelry. You'll walk out of my house with exactly what you brought into it." "Nothing." Julian tried to protest. He took a step forward. "Silas, please, you can't be this cruel. We're family." Silas moved faster than anyone could blink. He crossed the room and grabbed Julian by the lapels of his expensive coat. He slammed his brother against the stone wall. The impact knocked the breath out of Julian's lungs. Silas leaned in close. His dark eyes were burning with a terrifying rage. "Don't use that word in my presence again," Silas whispered fiercely. "You're a parasite. You left me to die in the dark. Now you'll learn what the dark truly feels like." He shoved Julian away in disgust. Julian stumbled and fell to his knees on the rug. Silas turned his back on them. He walked over to Clara. He stood beside her, presenting a united front of absolute power. "Get out," Silas commanded. It was not a request. It was an execution order. Julian slowly picked himself up from the floor. He did not look at his brother. He looked at Clara. He looked at the woman he had ordered out of the house just 10 minutes ago. Now she was the master of his fate. He looked away in shame. He walked to his mother and pulled her up by the arm. Lady Beatrice was crying openly. Her black silk morning dress looked utterly ridiculous now. They stumbled toward the doors. They did not take their coats. They did not take their silver pocket watches. They walked out of the grand drawing room as beggars. Clara stood perfectly still. She listened to their footsteps fading down the hallway. She heard the massive front doors open and close. The sound of the howling wind swept into the house for a brief second before the heavy would seal them out. The estate was quiet again. But it was not an empty silence anymore. It was a triumphant silence. Clara looked up at Silas. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading. She saw the pale exhaustion creeping back into his sharp features. He was incredibly strong, but he was still recovering from a fever that should have killed him. His broad shoulders slumped just a fraction of an inch. Clara did not hesitate. She stepped closer to him. She placed her hand on his chest. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. "They're gone," Clara said softly. Her voice was steady and comforting. Silas looked down at her. The dangerous predator disappeared from his eyes. He looked tired. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. His fingers were warm. He let out a long breath. "Yes," Silas murmured. "They're gone." He swayed slightly on his feet. Clara immediately wrapped her arm around his waist to steady him. She was much smaller than him, but she braced her weight against his side. She became his anchor. "You pushed yourself too far," Clara scolded gently. "You need to sit down before you collapse." Silas did not argue. He allowed her to guide him toward the heavy velvet sofa. He sank into the cushions. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The sheer force of will that had kept him standing was finally giving out. Clara walked over to the fire and added another oak log to the flames. The warmth filled the room. She walked back to the sofa and sat down beside him. She did not sit on the edge. She sat close to him. She was no longer afraid of the invisible boundaries of class and status. He had shattered those boundaries when he placed the diamond on her finger. Silas opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. "Are you afraid of me, little bird?" he asked quietly. The question was completely vulnerable. Clara looked at the man who had just destroyed his own family without raising his voice. He was terrifying. He was ruthless. But he was also the man who had fed a stray dog in the rain. He was the man who had promised her the world in the darkest hour of the night. Clara shook her head. "No, I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid for you. You need to rest." Silas reached out and took her hand. He pulled her slightly closer. He rested his forehead against her shoulder. It was a gesture of complete surrender. "I can't rest yet," Silas whispered against the blue velvet of her dress. "We have to prepare the townhouse in London. The season begins in exactly 1 month. And I'm going to walk into the grand ballroom with my new duchess." Clara felt a sudden wave of panic. She was a maid. She did not know how to dance. She did not know how to hold a silk fan. She did not know the complicated rules of high society. "I don't know how to be a duchess," Clara confessed. Her voice trembled slightly. "They'll laugh at me. They'll know I don't belong there." Silas lifted his head. He looked directly into her eyes. His gaze was entirely serious. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a warm kiss against her knuckles. The touch sent a jolt of pure fire straight to her heart. "They won't laugh," Silas promised softly. "They'll bow, because I'll teach you everything you need to know. And anyone who dares to look down on you will answer directly to me." He let go of her hand and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You fought for my life in the shadows, Clara. Now I'm going to fight for yours in the light. The entire world is going to learn your name." Clara looked at the blazing fire. The flames danced in the reflection of the massive diamond on her finger. The house of Blackwood was finally warm. The monsters had been cast out into the cold. And the most feared duke in England was looking at her as if she was the only precious thing left in the universe. She was no longer invisible. She was claimed. Everything had truly changed forever. The heavy winter snow finally began to melt outside the thick glass windows of Blackwood Hall. 7 days had passed since Julian and Lady Beatrice were banished into the freezing cold. The grand estate was no longer a silent tomb. Silas Thorne had summoned a dozen hand-picked men and women from the local village to serve as the new core staff. They were people who possessed absolute loyalty, chosen because Silas had secretly paid for their farms or medical bills over the years. Clara Miller sat at the massive oak dining table in the sunlit morning room. She wore a simple but elegant dark green dress that Silas had ordered from the village seamstress. The heavy diamond ring caught the morning sunlight and cast tiny rainbows across the polished wood. She was surrounded by stacks of leather-bound ledgers and financial documents. Silas sat across from her, drinking dark coffee from a porcelain cup. He watched her work with a quiet intensity. He had asked her to review the estate expenditures from the past 6 months. He wanted to know exactly how much money his brother had stolen before the fever struck. Clara moved her finger down a long column of numbers. Her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not just read the numbers. She understood them. Her father had taught her the mathematics of army logistics before his tragic downfall. She reached the bottom of the page and let out a soft sigh. "You found something," Silas stated quietly. He set his coffee cup down. Clara nodded and pushed the heavy ledger across the table toward him. "It's worse than we thought," Clara said. "Julian did not just steal the silver and the emergency funds. He's been bleeding the northern coal mines dry for over a year. He diverted almost $50,000 into a private account in London under a false name." Silas looked at the numbers. His jaw tightened into a hard line. He did not look surprised. He looked lethal. "He was preparing to usurp me long before I fell ill," Silas murmured. He looked back up at Clara. "You found this discrepancy in less than an hour. My chief accountant in London missed it for 12 months. Clara folded her hands together on the table. She felt the weight of his intense gaze. "My father was the quartermaster for his entire regiment," Clara explained softly. "He managed the supply chains, the payroll, and the food rations for 3,000 men. He taught me how to find a single missing bullet in a ledger of 10,000 pages." Silas leaned forward. He rested his arms on the table. "You told me he was a brilliant soldier but a terrible gambler," Silas said. "You said he lost everything over a debt in Boston. Tell me the rest of the story, Clara. I want to know exactly who broke your family." Clara looked down at her hands. The memory was a heavy stone in her chest. She had never told anyone the full truth. She had buried it to survive. But Silas was different. He had bared his darkest family secrets to her. He had given her his mother's ring. He deserved the truth. "His name was General Arthur Vance," Clara whispered. She forced herself to look up and meet his dark eyes. "My father did not gamble the money away. General Vance stole the regiment payroll. He took almost $100,000. When the army investigators arrived, Vance planted forged documents in my father's desk. He framed him." Silas did not move. The air in the room seemed to grow perfectly still. Clara took a deep breath and continued her painful story. "My father was dishonorably discharged. We lost our home. We lost our pension. General Vance demanded a $300 bribe to keep my father out of military prison. That was the debt." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. "My father sold my service contract to pay it. He thought he was saving me from prison, but he died of a broken heart a month later. And General Vance walked away a wealthy hero." Silas stood up from the table. He walked over to the tall windows and looked out at the melting snow. He remained silent for a long time. The silence was not empty. It was filled with a terrifying, calculating energy. He turned around and walked back to her chair. He placed his large hands on her shoulders. His touch was firm and grounding. "Arthur Vance is no longer a general in Boston," Silas said. His voice was dangerously low and smooth. "He moved to England 3 years ago. He bought a title. He is now Lord Vance. He sits in the House of Lords in London." Clara froze. Her blood ran cold. The man who had destroyed her family was in the very city they were preparing to enter. "You know him?" she asked breathlessly. "I know everyone," Silas replied. He moved his hands from her shoulders and gently cupped her face. He forced her to look into his unwavering eyes. "He is attending the royal ball next month. He thinks he is untouchable. He thinks the little girl whose life he ruined is scrubbing floors in the dirt." Silas smiled. It was the same predatory smile he had worn when he banished his brother. It was a smile that promised absolute ruin for his enemies. "I told you I was going to teach you how to be a duchess, Clara," Silas said softly. "But I think we are going to do something much better." We are going to build you an empire. And the very first thing you are going to do as the Duchess of Blackwood is look Lord Vance in the eye and take back everything he stole from your father." Clara felt a sudden surge of fire in her veins. The fear that had haunted her for years completely evaporated. She was not a helpless maid anymore. She was protected by a monster who loved her. She reached up and placed her hand over his. "I'll do it," Clara said fiercely. "I'm not afraid of him anymore." Silas leaned down and pressed a slow, burning kiss against her forehead. "Good," Silas whispered against her skin. "Because when we arrive in London, we aren't just going to attend the season. We are going to burn it to the ground." The journey to London took 3 days inside the heavy black carriage of the Blackwood estate. The vehicle moved like a dark shadow across the thawing English countryside. Clara Miller sat opposite Silas Thorne upon the plush velvet seats. She wore a traveling gown of dark emerald wool that kept the lingering winter chill away. Her heavy diamond ring was hidden safely beneath her leather gloves. She looked out the glass window at the passing towns with a quiet intensity. She was no longer a maid drawing freezing water from a rusted pump. She was heading into the heart of the most powerful city in the world to face the monster who had destroyed her family. Silas watched her in absolute silence. He did not read the leather-bound books resting beside him. He only studied her face. He saw the ghosts of her past shifting behind her eyes. The London townhouse of the Blackwood family was a massive stone fortress located in the center of Mayfair. It was entirely shut down when they arrived. The staff had believed the rumors of the Duke's death and expected Julian to arrive soon to claim the property. When Silas stepped out of the carriage, the head butler nearly fainted on the marble steps. Silas did not raise his voice. He simply ordered the house to be opened and prepared for the Duchess. The word sent a shockwave through the terrified staff. They bowed deeply to Clara without a single question. They did not care about her simple origins. They only saw the absolute authority of the man standing right beside her. The next 2 weeks were a blur of intense preparation. Silas hired the most expensive modiste in London. He ordered silk, velvet, and lace to be brought directly to the townhouse. He did not allow Clara to go to the public shops. He brought the entire world to her doorstep. Clara stood on a small wooden pedestal in the master suite while 3 seamstresses pinned a magnificent gown of midnight blue silk around her waist. Silas sat in a velvet chair by the window. He supervised every single detail. He rejected 5 different designs before he was completely satisfied. "It needs to look like armor," Silas told the head seamstress softly. "She's not going to a garden party. She's going to a war." The seamstress nodded frantically and added more heavy silver embroidery to the bodice. Clara looked at her reflection in the tall gilded mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her hair was swept up into an elegant style. Her posture was perfectly straight. The fear that had defined her entire life was completely gone. In its place was a quiet and dangerous resolve. The night of the royal ball finally arrived. The air in London was crisp and cold. The streets were lined with carriages carrying the wealthiest families in the entire country. Clara stood in the grand foyer of the townhouse. She wore the midnight blue gown. The heavy silver embroidery caught the light of the massive crystal chandelier overhead. Silas walked down the marble staircase. He wore a perfectly tailored black evening suit. A crisp white cravat rested at his throat. He looked devastatingly handsome and utterly terrifying. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her. The silence stretched between them for a long moment. It was a heavy and breathless silence. He reached into his dark coat pocket and pulled out a flat velvet box. He opened it to reveal a magnificent necklace of diamonds and deep blue sapphires. The jewels matched the ring on her finger perfectly. Silas stepped behind her. He fastened the heavy chain around her neck. The cold metal rested against her collarbone. "You look exactly like the queen of my house," Silas whispered near her ear. His breath was warm against her skin. "Are you ready to face the ghosts?" Clara looked down at the diamonds. She thought of her father. She thought of the $300 debt that had ruined him. She lifted her chin. "I'm not afraid of ghosts," Clara replied steadily. "Let's go." The ride to the royal palace took 20 minutes. The silence in the carriage was thick with anticipation. When they pulled up to the grand entrance, a footman opened the door. The loud music and the roar of 1,000 conversations spilled out into the night air. Silas stepped out first. He turned and offered his hand to Clara. She placed her gloved hand in his. She stepped out of the carriage. The courtyard was crowded with aristocrats arriving for the prestigious event. The moment Silas Thorne stepped into the light, the crowd went completely still. The laughter died in their throats. The rumors had spread like wildfire over the past month. Everyone believed the Duke of Blackwood was dead. They believed his greedy brother Julian was the new heir. Yet here he was. He was not a rotting corpse. He was a towering mountain of power standing on the red carpet. The shock was absolute. Then their eyes shifted to the woman standing beside him. Clara did not look away from their stares. She held her head high. She felt the warmth of his hand anchoring her to the earth. They walked up the grand staircase together. The crowd parted for them like water. People literally stepped back to avoid brushing against the Duke's dark coat. The master of ceremonies stood at the top of the stairs. His face was pale and sweating. He looked at the guest list and then looked at Silas in sheer terror. "Your Grace," the man stammered weakly. "We were informed. We thought." Silas did not let him finish. "You thought wrong," Silas stated coldly. "Announce us." The master of ceremonies swallowed hard. He turned to face the massive ballroom. He slammed his wooden staff against the marble floor 3 times. The sound echoed through the cavernous space. "His Grace Silas Thorne, the Duke of Blackwood," the man shouted loudly. The entire ballroom fell dead silent. The orchestra stopped playing abruptly. Thousands of eyes turned toward the grand entrance. The master of ceremonies looked back at Silas with a questioning panic in his eyes. He did not know Clara's name. Silas leaned closer to the man and whispered a single sentence. The man nodded frantically and turned back to the crowd. He struck his staff against the floor one more time. And presenting his wife, the man yelled into the quiet room. "Her Grace, Clara Thorne, the Duchess of Blackwood." The collective gasp of the high society was deafening. Whispers erupted like a swarm of angry bees. Women hid behind their feathered fans. Men stared in open shock. Silas did not care about their reactions. He placed his hand on the small of Clara's back and guided her into the room. They walked down the center of the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light over them. Clara felt 1,000 eyes dissecting her. They were searching for a flaw. They were trying to figure out what royal family she belonged to. They did not know she had drawn water from a frozen pump just a few weeks ago. They only saw the massive sapphire necklace resting proudly against her chest. Silas leaned down slightly. "Don't look at them," Silas instructed softly. "They're nothing but vultures in expensive suits. Keep your eyes on the far end of the room." Clara obeyed his command. She focused her gaze on the long tables covered in silver platters and crystal glasses. She walked with the quiet grace of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Suddenly Silas stopped moving. His grip on her waist tightened just a fraction. Clara stopped beside him. She followed his line of sight. Standing near a massive marble pillar was an older man in a decorated military uniform. His chest was covered in shining medals. He was laughing with a group of wealthy lords. He held a glass of champagne in his hand. Clara felt her heart stop completely. The air was sucked directly out of her lungs. It was him, General Arthur Vance, Lord Vance, the man who had framed her father and sold her into slavery. He looked older, but his cruel eyes were exactly the same. He had not noticed them yet. He was too busy enjoying the wealth he had stolen from her family. Clara felt her hands begin to tremble. The dark memories threatened to pull her under. She felt like a frightened 17-year-old girl all over again. Silas felt her tremor immediately. He stepped slightly in front of her. He blocked her from the monster's view. He reached down and took her trembling hand in his. He squeezed it firmly. The warmth of his skin grounded her instantly. "Look at me," Silas commanded gently. Clara forced her eyes away from the man. She looked up into the dark, protective eyes of her husband. "He's just a man, Clara," Silas whispered. He's a coward wearing stolen medals. He broke a weak man in Boston. But you aren't weak. And you aren't alone. You're the Duchess of Blackwood. You hold the power to crush him with a single word. Do you understand me? Clara took a deep breath. She felt the heavy diamonds resting against her skin. She felt the absolute certainty in the Duke's gaze. The fear evaporated completely. A cold and hard anger took its place. She was not a victim anymore. She was the executioner. I understand, Clara replied. Her voice was steady and laced with pure ice. I'm ready. Silas smiled his terrifying smile. He let go of her hand and offered his arm. Clara wrapped her gloved hands around his sleeve. They turned back toward the marble pillar. Silas did not walk around the large crowd. He walked directly through them. The aristocrats scrambled to get out of his way. General Vance finally heard the sudden silence spreading toward him. He turned around. He saw the towering figure of the Duke of Blackwood approaching. Vance's face broke into a wide fake smile. He did not recognize the beautiful woman beside the Duke. He only saw a massive political opportunity. Vance stepped forward to greet the most powerful man in England, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into his own grave. General Arthur Vance lowered his crystal glass of champagne as the towering figure of Silas Thorne stopped less than 3 feet away from him. The older man plastered a wide and completely false smile across his weathered face. He bowed his head slightly. The golden medals pinned to his dark military jacket clinked together with a hollow metallic sound. Your Grace, Vance said loudly. We'd all heard the terrible rumors of your passing. It's a profound relief to see you standing here in such excellent health. The entire country rejoices at your return. Silas did not smile. He did not extend his hand to accept the greeting. He simply stared down at the older man with eyes that looked like black ice. The silence stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds. The aristocrats standing nearby held their breath. They knew the Duke of Blackwood never did anything without a terrifying reason. Vance shifted his weight uncomfortably. His smile began to falter under the crushing weight of the Duke's silent glare. He cleared his throat and turned his attention to the stunning woman standing beside Silas. Vance's eyes swept over her midnight blue silk gown and the massive diamond and sapphire necklace resting against her collarbone. He did not recognize her. He only saw a beautiful aristocrat who held the heart of the most powerful man in England. And I must offer my deepest congratulations on your marriage, Vance continued smoothly. He offered Clara a polite bow. I don't believe I've had the absolute honor of meeting the new Duchess of Blackwood. I'm Lord Arthur Vance. Clara looked at the man who had destroyed her entire world. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. She could hear the roaring rush of blood in her ears. She remembered the day this man had stood in her small family home in Boston. She remembered the cruel smirk on his face as he demanded $300 to keep her father out of a military prison. She remembered the sound of the carriage wheels taking her away into servitude. She felt a sudden wave of nausea. But then she felt the solid heat of Silas standing right beside her. His massive presence was an unbreakable shield. She took a slow and deep breath. She lifted her chin. She looked directly into the cold eyes of the monster. You don't remember me, Lord Vance, Clara said. Her voice was remarkably steady. It carried across the quiet space like a silver bell. But you knew my father. You knew him very well in Boston. Vance furrowed his brow. He looked confused. He searched his memory for a wealthy aristocrat from the American colonies. I fear you've got me at a disadvantage, Your Grace, Vance replied politely. I served with many honorable men across the ocean. What was your father's name? Clara did not blink. She let the silence build until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. His name was Captain Thomas Miller, Clara stated clearly. The color instantly drained from Vance's face. He looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He stared at Clara in disbelief. The polite smile completely vanished. He recognized her now. He saw the face of the desperate 17-year-old girl he had forced into slavery. He saw the daughter of the man he had framed for stealing a military payroll. Vance took a clumsy step backward. His heel caught the edge of a heavy velvet curtain. He nearly lost his balance. "That's impossible," Vance whispered hoarsely. "You're the Miller girl. You're a servant. You can't be the Duchess of Blackwood. This is some kind of ridiculous joke." Silas stepped forward. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to plummet to freezing. "Do I look like a man who tells jokes, Arthur?" Silas asked softly. His voice was a lethal rumble that sent shivers down the spines of the watching nobles. "My wife is speaking to you. I highly suggest you listen very carefully." Vance began to sweat profusely. The expensive collar of his uniform suddenly looked too tight. He looked around the room. He realized that hundreds of the most powerful people in the country were watching this confrontation. He tried to laugh. It sounded like the bark of a frightened dog. "Your Grace, I think you've been terribly deceived," Vance said frantically. "This woman comes from a family of thieves. Her father was a disgraced soldier. He stole $100,000 from the army. I caught him myself. She's lying to you to steal your fortune." Clara did not retreat. She stepped closer to the trembling man. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the quiet authority of a true duchess. "My father was an honorable man," Clara said. "He kept the supply ledgers perfectly balanced for 5 years. He trusted you, and you repaid that trust by stealing the payroll and hiding the forged documents in his desk. You demanded a bribe of $300 to drop the false charges. When he couldn't pay, you forced him to sell my contract of service. You killed him just as surely as if you'd shot him in the chest." The surrounding crowd gasped in horror. Accusing a decorated lord of theft and extortion in the middle of a royal ball was entirely unprecedented. It was a scandal that would burn through London for a decade. Vance turned bright red with rage and panic. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "How dare you?" Vance spat out. "You're a filthy little liar. You've got absolutely no proof. You're nothing but a common maid dressed up in stolen jewels. I'll have you arrested for slander. I'll see you hang for this." Silas moved so fast it was a blur. He grabbed Vance by the front of his decorated uniform. He lifted the older man an inch off the marble floor. Vance let out a pathetic squeak of terror. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the ground. Several guards rushed forward to intervene, but a single dark look from the Duke stopped them dead in their tracks. No one dared to touch Silas Thorne. "You'll never speak to my wife in that tone again," Silas whispered violently. His face was inches from Vance's sweating forehead. "And you're entirely wrong about the proof. I spent the last 2 weeks using my considerable wealth to track down every single soldier in your former regiment. I found the quartermaster you paid to forge those documents. I found the bank in London where you deposited the stolen American payroll. I have a sworn confession from your own lieutenant." Silas dropped Vance. The older man stumbled and fell to his knees in the broken glass. He was gasping for air. His medals scraped against the hard marble floor. The powerful lord looked entirely pathetic. "I've already sent the evidence to the king's magistrate," Silas continued coldly. "The royal guards are waiting outside the palace gates right now. They've got a warrant for your arrest. You're going to be stripped of your purchase title. You're going to forfeit every single penny you own. And you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a cold prison cell." Vance looked up at the towering Duke. Tears of genuine terror streamed down his wrinkled face. He realized he was completely ruined. He turned his desperate eyes toward Clara. He clasped his hands together in a begging gesture. "Please," Vance sobbed. "Please, your Grace. I beg you. I was a fool. I was greedy. Have mercy on an old man. I'll give you everything I have. I'll publicly clear your father's name. Just don't send me to prison. I won't survive it." Clara looked down at the man who had caused her so much pain. She remembered the nights she had cried herself to sleep on hard wooden floors. She remembered the brutal cold. She remembered the terrible feeling of being entirely invisible and worthless. She looked at his pathetic tears. She felt absolutely nothing for him. "You didn't show my father any mercy when he begged for his life," Clara said quietly. "You didn't show me any mercy when you threw me into a carriage and sent me away. You're a monster, and monsters don't deserve mercy." Clara turned her back on him. It was the ultimate gesture of dismissal. She reached out and took her husband's arm. Silas looked at the weeping man on the floor one last time. "You should have stayed in Boston, Arthur," Silas said softly. "Because in England, nobody touches what belongs to the Duke of Blackwood." Silas led Clara away from the shattered man. They walked slowly back toward the center of the grand ballroom. The crowd parted for them in absolute awe. No one whispered a single word of doubt about the new Duchess. They had just watched her destroy a powerful lord with quiet dignity and unshakable grace. They did not care where she came from. They only knew that she was terrifyingly magnificent. The royal guards marched into the ballroom a moment later. They hauled a screaming and crying Lord Vance out the heavy doors. The sound of his ruin echoed through the palace. Clara did not look back. She felt a massive weight lift from her chest. The ghost of her father was finally at peace. She looked up at Silas. The coldness in his eyes had completely melted away. He looked at her with a mixture of immense pride and profound love. "Are you all right?" Silas asked. His voice was incredibly gentle. Clara smiled. It was a true and radiant smile. "I'm perfectly fine," Clara answered. "I think I'm finally ready to dance." Silas smiled back. It was not a terrifying smile. It was a smile that promised a beautiful future. He led her onto the polished dance floor as the orchestra slowly began to play a waltz. He placed his hand on her waist and swept her into the music. Clara Miller, the abandoned daughter and the forgotten maid, danced under the crystal chandeliers as the undisputed queen of Blackwood Hall. The carriage ride back to the Mayfair townhouse was wrapped in a comfortable and profound silence. The streets of London were blanketed in the quiet dark of the early morning hours. The rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves against the cobblestones echoed through the freezing night. The pale light of the gas lamps flickered through the frosted glass windows of the carriage. Clara sat beside Silas on the plush velvet seats. She did not look out at the passing city. She looked down at her own hands resting in her lap. The heavy diamond and sapphire ring caught the faint light and sparkled with a quiet fire. The crushing weight that had sat upon her chest for 5 long years was completely gone. Lord Arthur Vance was sitting in a freezing cell at this very moment. He was stripped of his stolen medals and his purchased title. Her father was no longer a disgraced soldier in the eyes of the world. His name was washed clean. The truth was finally known. Clara felt a single tear slip down her cheek. It was not a tear of pain or humiliation. It was a tear of absolute relief. Silas reached out in the dim light of the carriage. He gently wiped the wet streak away with the pad of his thumb. His touch was incredibly warm against her cold skin. He did not ask if she was crying. He did not demand an explanation for her sudden rush of emotions. He simply offered his silent strength. He pulled her gently against his side. Clara rested her head against his broad shoulder. She closed her eyes and listened to the steady beating of his heart beneath his tailored suit coat. It was the exact same heartbeat she had protected in the darkest room of Blackwood Hall. The carriage finally slowed to a halt in front of their massive stone fortress. The footman opened the door and the freezing winter air rushed inside. Silas stepped out first. He turned and offered his large hand. Clara placed her gloved fingers into his palm. She stepped down onto the frozen street. The temperature was easily 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but she did not feel the bitter cold. The grand townhouse was entirely silent. The staff had retired for the night. Only a few candles remained lit in the silver wall sconces along the corridors. Silas did not lead her toward the grand sweeping staircase to their sleeping chambers. He guided her gently down the long hallway toward his private study. Clara walked beside him without a single question. She trusted him entirely. He opened the heavy oak door and they stepped inside the dark room. The study smelled of rich leather, expensive ink, and the dying embers of a wood fire. Silas walked over to the massive stone hearth and placed a fresh oak log onto the iron grate. He used the heavy iron poker to stoke the embers until a warm golden light filled the room. Clara stood in the center of the study. She watched the firelight dance across the sharp angles of his face. He looked like a terrifying king who had just returned from conquering a foreign land. He turned away from the fire and walked over to his massive mahogany desk. He opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick brown envelope secured with a heavy red wax seal. He did not sit down. He walked back to Clara and held the envelope out to her. "I have something else for you," Silas said softly. "I wanted to give it to you before the ball, but I knew the timing wasn't right." Clara looked at the heavy paper. She did not reach for it immediately. Her heart gave a sudden nervous flutter. "What is it?" she asked. "You've already given me the entire world tonight. You gave me back my father. I don't need anything else." Silas smiled. It was a gentle and completely unguarded expression. It transformed his fearsome features into something breathtakingly beautiful. "I told you I was going to build you an empire, Clara," Silas replied. "An empire requires a solid foundation." He took her hand and pressed the envelope into her palm. He closed her fingers over the stiff paper. "Open it." Clara slowly broke the red wax seal. Her fingers trembled slightly in the quiet room. She pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. The top page bore the official stamp of the American Registry Office in Boston. She read the first few lines of the heavy black ink. The words did not make sense at first. She read them again. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. It was a property deed. It was the deed to a large farmhouse and 50 acres of land located just outside the city limits of Boston. It was her childhood home. It was the exact house where she had learned to read maps with her father before their lives fell apart. It was the house they had lost when General Vance framed him for the stolen payroll. Clara stared at the paper in absolute shock. The document stated that the property was purchased in full and registered permanently under the name of Clara Miller Thorne. "I sent my best agents across the ocean the very moment my fever broke," Silas explained quietly. His deep voice resonated in the warm study. "I told them to find the man who bought your family estate. I told them to offer him 3 times the market value. If he refused the offer, I told them to buy the entire bank that held his mortgage and threatened to call in his debts immediately." Silas took a step closer to her. He looked down into her wide and tear-filled eyes. "He accepted the money without hesitation. The house belongs to you now. It's yours forever." Clara could not speak. Her throat was completely tight. She held the deed against her chest as if it were a fragile living thing. She thought about the beautiful apple orchard behind the house. She thought about the large wooden porch where her father used to sit and smoke his pipe in the cool autumn evenings. She had believed that those precious memories were locked away in a painful past she could never revisit. She had believed she was nothing but a worthless servant who had to forget where she came from to survive the cruelties of the world. But Silas Thorne had reached across a massive ocean to gather the broken pieces of her life. He had put them back together with his own hands. "You bought my home," Clara whispered. Her voice broke on the final word. "You gave him back his honor, and you bought my home." Silas reached out and gently cupped her face. He smoothed his rough thumbs over her cheekbones. "I didn't buy it for your father," Silas said firmly. "I bought it for the 17-year-old girl who was forced onto a carriage because the men in her life were too weak to protect her. I wanted you to own the ground where you were broken. I wanted you to know that nobody will ever have the power to cast you out again." Clara looked up at the towering Duke. She saw the absolute devotion burning fiercely in his dark eyes. He was a man made of stone and iron to the rest of the world. He was feared by kings and lords. He was ruthless to his enemies. He had destroyed his own brother without a second thought. But to her, he was the safest harbor she had ever known. He had seen her when she was completely invisible to everyone else. He had recognized her immense worth when she was wearing a cheap gray apron. He had built an impenetrable fortress around her with his wealth and his terrible power. Clara let the legal documents fall onto the mahogany desk. She did not care about the paper anymore. She only cared about the man standing in front of her. She reached up and wrapped her slender arms around his strong neck. She pulled him down and pressed her lips against his. It was not a hesitant or shy kiss. It was a kiss forged in fire and desperate survival. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his solid chest. He kissed her back with a fierce and overwhelming hunger. The world outside the heavy oak doors completely ceased to exist. There were no more arrogant aristocrats. There were no more cruel family members plotting in the shadows. There was only the crackling fire in the hearth and the absolute certainty of their bond. Silas slowly pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers. They were both breathing heavily in the quiet room. "You're my home now," Clara whispered fiercely. "I don't care about Boston. I don't care about the townhouse or the massive estate. I only care about where you are." Silas closed his eyes for a brief second. A look of profound peace settled over his sharp features. It was the look of a weary man who had finally stopped fighting a bitter war inside his own mind. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Then you'll never be homeless again, little bird," Silas promised. "Because I'll never let you go." He picked her up effortlessly in his strong arms. Clara gasped softly and rested her head against his shoulder. He carried her out of the study and up the grand sweeping staircase toward the master suite. The dark shadows of the hallway retreated as they passed the flickering candles. Clara held tightly to the lapels of his dark coat. She thought about the terrifying night she had hauled freezing water from the iron pump at Blackwood Hall. She thought about the broken porcelain pitcher and the terrible heat of his deadly fever. She thought about the moment he had grabbed her wrist in the pitch-black room and promised her the world. He had not lied. He had given her absolutely everything. He had given her sweet vengeance. He had given her quiet dignity. And most importantly, he had given her his entire heart. The Duke of Blackwood carried his Duchess into their chambers and gently kicked the heavy door shut. The loud metallic click of the lock echoed in the silent hallway. They were completely sealed away from the coldness of the world. The forgotten girl who had been sold for $300 was finally exactly where she belonged. The morning sun poured through the heavy velvet curtains of the master suite inside the London townhouse. It was not the pale and freezing light of the winter storm that had almost taken his life. It was the bright and golden light of a new beginning. Clara Thorne opened her eyes and felt the heavy silk sheets resting against her skin. She turned her head on the soft pillow. Silas was already awake. He was lying on his side. He was watching her sleep. The terrifying Duke of Blackwood looked completely at peace. The sharp and angry lines of his face had softened into something incredibly tender. Clara smiled and reached out to trace the strong line of his jaw. Her diamond ring sparkled in the morning light. "You're staring at me," Clara whispered. Silas caught her hand and pressed a warm kiss to her palm. "I'm making up for all the years I didn't know you existed," Silas replied. His voice was a deep and comforting rumble in the quiet room. "I want to look at you for the rest of my life." The next 3 months passed like a beautiful dream. The royal season of London was completely dominated by the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood. No one dared to whisper a single negative word about Clara's humble origins. The absolute destruction of Lord Arthur Vance had served as a terrifying warning to the entire aristocracy. The gossiping lords and ladies quickly realized that Clara was not a weak woman hiding behind a powerful man. She possessed her own quiet and formidable strength. She managed the massive Blackwood fortune with the brilliant mind of a military general. She reorganized the northern coal mines and increased the wages of the workers. She established a private foundation in London dedicated to purchasing the service contracts of young girls who had been sold to pay family debts. She gave them an education and a chance to build their own lives. She became known as the most generous and the most untouchable woman in England. Silas stood by her side through every single victory. He did not try to control her. He simply watched her shine and destroyed anyone who tried to stand in her way. When the spring finally melted the last of the winter snow, they left the busy streets of London and returned to the grand estate of Blackwood Hall. The journey took 3 days. The black carriage rolled through the massive iron gates on a warm Tuesday afternoon. The estate did not look like a frozen tomb anymore. The gardens were blooming with vibrant colors. The heavy oak doors were thrown wide open to welcome the warm breeze. The new staff stood in a perfectly straight line in the courtyard. They bowed deeply as the Duke and Duchess stepped out of the carriage. Clara wore a beautiful walking dress of pale green silk. She did not wear an apron. She did not carry a porcelain basin of cold water. She walked up the marble steps as the absolute master of the house. Silas placed his hand on the small of her back as they entered the grand foyer. The air smelled of fresh flowers and lemon wax. It did not smell of sickness or fear. Mrs. Gable, the cruel housekeeper who had abandoned Silas to die, was long gone. The new head housekeeper stepped forward and handed Clara a heavy ring of brass keys. It was the symbol of her absolute authority over the massive estate. Clara took the keys with a gracious nod. She remembered the freezing night she had locked the iron gates to trap the monsters outside. Now, she held the keys to open the doors to a beautiful future. Later that evening, Clara walked down the long hallway of the West Wing. She stopped in front of the grand drawing room. The heavy oak doors were open. A bright fire roared in the massive stone hearth. Silas was standing near the fireplace. He was holding a crystal glass of expensive brandy. He looked up as she entered the room. He set the glass down on the silver tray. He held out his hand to her. Clara walked across the expensive Persian rug and placed her hand in his. He pulled her gently into his arms. He buried his face in the soft curve of her neck. He breathed in the sweet scent of her skin. "I received a letter from the estate manager today," Silas murmured against her hair. "Julian and Beatrice are complaining about the dampness in the swamp cottage. They're demanding a larger allowance for coal." Clara rested her head against his broad chest. She felt absolutely no pity for the people who had treated him like garbage. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Silas lifted his head and looked down at her. His dark eyes held a wicked gleam. "I'm going to send them a single blanket," Silas answered smoothly. "And I'm going to tell them that the Duchess of Blackwood suggested they learn how to chop their own wood." Clara laughed softly. It was a beautiful and genuine sound that echoed through the warm room. She reached up and adjusted the crisp white cravat at his throat. "You're terrible," Clara said with a smile. Silas wrapped his massive arms tighter around her waist. "I'm a monster, little bird. We established this a long time ago." He leaned down and captured her lips in a deep and passionate kiss. It was a kiss that held all the promises of the dark night and all the victories of the bright morning. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. Silas rested his forehead against hers. "They sold you for $300, Silas whispered fiercely. "And my family left me to rot in a freezing bed. The world tried to crush us both, but they failed." Clara looked into the eyes of the man she loved with her entire soul. She saw the absolute truth in his words. The invisible maid and the dying duke did not exist anymore. They had burned the old world to the ground and built a kingdom from the ashes. "They failed because they didn't know we were meant to find each other," Clara replied quietly. She stepped out of his embrace and walked toward the tall glass windows. She looked out over the sprawling green lawns of the Blackwood estate. The sun was setting over the horizon, painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and deep purple. Silas walked up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head. They stood together in perfect silence. They watched the daylight fade into a peaceful dusk. There were no more secrets. There were no more threats hiding in the shadows. The painful past was permanently locked away. Clara Miller had walked into this house with absolutely nothing. She had expected to live a life of quiet suffering and invisible labor. But she had chosen to stay when everyone else ran away. She had chosen to show mercy to a man made of stone. And because of that single fearless choice, everything had changed forever.